Hey, welcome back. Joining me again is Todd Harrison, the founding partner and CIO of CB1 Capital Management. Todd, thanks for joining me again today.
Thank you.
Todd, I wanted to run through a couple of things with you and get your thoughts on, we'll start with this idea that we have a lot of these companies in the US coming to the Canadian market with very large market caps. We'll use Acreage Holdings as an example. Came to market with a $2.4 billion market cap, call it, after doing a $25 per share IPO. And the companies are demonstrating this propensity to come to market with a super voting structure that precludes the ability of retail shareholders from participating meaningfully on a voting basis in the direction of the company. And I'm curious as to how does that affect how you feel about these companies?
Well, I mean, listen, it's not optimal, but it's also not the first time we've seen this. Facebook, I believe, has a similar structure, and we've seen others. Certainly not, not the best case scenario if you're looking at building a relationship with your investors and one of meritocracy that you're going to be held accountable for. But I think what we're seeing with a lot of these U.S. multi-state operators that are coming to Canada is you're seeing a lot of hair on these things, right? There's a lot of warrants, there's a lot of fluff in there. Canadian elbow grease, we'll call it for lack of a better term.
Right.
And, I think this is just sort of the cost of doing business, given that these names can't list more traditional exchanges, and they are making deals with these shell companies for RTOs so that they can get public. But as a whole, I think for any of these multi-state operators, we're sort of throwing a dart from a valuation standpoint. We're going to need a couple of quarters, a couple of years even, for these companies to really start to grow into these multiples and start to demonstrate earnings power. And I think we think they will. We own all of these companies, and we continue to buy it under market here.
Oh, so you're buying these companies when they come to market?
Yep. We were buying partial positions for sure. And I've been on Wall Street 30 years. When these stocks break issue price, traditionally that's a pretty negative sign. But with RTOs, it's very different than IPOs in that these bankers are not sitting there supporting the deals. So they are free trading, and you have a lot of, I think, fast money that was buying these things for an initial pop. We're playing long ball here. We think that the best is in front of the U.S. operators, both in terms of institutions. That institutional demand is still on the horizon. We think Canada turns buyer, and we think the U.S. market, by and large, with the end products and a lot of the use cases that we think will emerge, are going to really drive these earnings going forward. But literally, like first inning stuff right now, just coming to market and getting comfortable in its own skin.
Sure. So we look at the biggest companies. GW Pharma, you were mentioning earlier, has had a sort of revaluation to the downside. What do you think is driving that, and what do you think that the prognosis is for the near term for GW?
Yeah, no, so still our favorite position, still our largest holding. Price doesn't change that. Facts aren't insults, right? Stock was at 180, on the back of getting approval for Epidiolex, which is their epilepsy drug. FDA approval, the DEA came out with a Schedule 5, which was best case scenario. And then you saw just the entire biotech complex come for sale. I think the space is down 20-25% since the beginning of October. So, GW is not immune. Corbis, another one of our top holdings, also wasn't immune. But we look at GW, and I really, I say this all the time, but I think it really encapsulates sort of the market's misunderstanding with cannabis. People still think this is a discretionary vice. Not too many people are even contemplating cannabis as a biotech play, and certainly the efficacious agility. We own this for brain cancer, right? We think they're an oncology company dressed up as an epilepsy platform. But until that data comes out, and still they can't release it because too many people are still surviving from February 2017. We're talking about brain cancer here.
Right.
Pretty exciting stuff, but
Right.
until the results come out, I think people are still going to look at this thing and look at it as an epilepsy platform. And certainly Epidiolex is awesome, but we think there's a lot more to the story.
Interesting. So are you focused a lot on the idea of cannabinoids as pharmaceutical ingredients to treat indications in maladies like cancer, like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's? I mean, all of these things are demonstrating, at least at preliminary basis, some efficacy as a result of cannabis treatment. So are there
Yeah, no,
other?
certainly. We want to follow the science, and we were just telling the story before we came on air that the endocannabinoid system, which regulates your neurotransmissions, wasn't discovered until 1990. So a lot of medical doctors aren't even aware of what it does or what the role or how important a role this is for wellness and for and just in terms of unlocking a lot of these medical riddles that have stymied doctors for a long time. But certainly, we think we're scratching the surface of the science and understanding sort of the efficacious agility of the cannabis plant. Remember, humanity's had a 30,000-year relationship with this plant, and it was medicine. It was prescribed by the American Medical Association for over 100 indications before it was weaponized as an immigration tool in the 20s by the U.S. government. So, this is very much, this last 90 years is very much it's the exception rather than the rule in terms of society's relationship with cannabis. Going forward, the way we're framing our wellness book is on the one side, we have these efficacy-driven solutions, right? Medicine, clinical trials, more traditional biotech pathway. That's where we get really excited because we think that's where the baton is going to get handed during this next phase of the cannabis secular bull market. But on the other side is really, I think, what the market's really beginning to understand, and that's really the consumer side of the equation, right? The beverages and the nutraceuticals and the consumer packaged goods, the bath bombs, right? That's going to be a huge market, and that's wellness as well. And even, we sort of have taken the gloves off between recreational and medical because we figure a lot of people have been self-medicating for a long time. They don't even realize that this is medicine. They think it's more of a discretionary vice.
Interesting. So are there any names you can share with us of up-and-coming companies that you're particularly excited about?
Well, on the biotech side, GW, I talked about Corbis, we're big fans of. There's a few others on the biosynthetic side. There's a company called InMed Pharmaceuticals, which is early, right, preclinical, but it's a biosynthetic, and we think that the trend is really going to move toward biosynthetics away from the more traditional farming side. So whenever we look at investments, we really try to, with the exception of Village Farms, which we think is a unique situation given their U.S. and Mexican optionality, we really try to steer clear of the pure cultivators because we think the farming side is probably the least sexy side of the equation, right? The margins are all on the back end. And as we reach this equilibrium from a pricing standpoint and cannabis comes online in entire continents, right? Whether it's South America or whether it's Australia, or whether, all over the world, this is starting to come online. Ultimately, that's going to drive prices down. Who is that going to hurt? It's going to hurt the producers of the ingredient. Who's it going to help? It's going to help the consumers of the ingredient. So anybody who's using cannabis or hemp as an ingredient, which is sort of how we're looking at the world, we think they're going to benefit from lower prices in time. Margins are going to expand. That's why we look at the back end. That's why we look at end products. That's why we're looking at the consumer side as opposed to the farming side.
Sure. So we've seen some of the financials come out from the earliest LPs that got in the game in Canada, and without exception, they have been underwhelming in terms of anything approaching the idea of profitability. If anything, the bigger they are, the more money they're losing, even though potentially you have to look at it as well. Yes, on an accounting basis, it counts as a loss, but from an investment perspective, in the case of Canopy, particularly where they've deployed $330 million in capital, well, they're sitting on $5 billion, and they're investing this capital to grow markets in other places. And so, yes, on the one hand, an accounting basis, it's a loss. On the other hand, it's an investment that hasn't started to produce yet. But what is your take on all of the earnings that we've seen so far this month and the ones that are yet to come?
Yeah, no, I think, first of all, we have about 9% of our portfolio in Canada right now because they've had big runs, because this is going to take some time, right? So what's our take is that, it's going to be sloppy. Anybody who bought Canopy or any of these names for their first quarter's earnings report, I think shouldn't be buying these stocks, right? These are long tail stories. They've got to grow into their multiples. They've got to use their paper to make accretive deals, right? They got to use their paper as currency, which we think we're going to see a lot of as soon as the U.S. gets in shape here. So, certainly bumpy. It's going to take time. It's going to take a few quarters, if not years, for these things to really start to demonstrate their value propositions. But we are skewed more heavily to U.S. operators for reasons that I'm happy to talk about. But by and large, we think that institutional demand is still in front of us, and that's why we're positioned as we are.
All right, Todd, we're going to leave it there for now. Very insightful as usual. Thank you so much. We'll come back to you in another week and see what you've got to say for yourself. I appreciate your input.
Thank you, James.